Hi, I'm Linda Mao, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Nasher Sculpture Center. This is part one of our interview with artist Phyllida Barlow about her exhibition, Phyllida Barlow, Tryst. Now for Art This Week.
Phyllida, thank you so much for meeting with me today for Art This Week. This is the opening tonight of your new solo exhibition at the Nasher Sculpture Center. Are you feeling ready for it?
Good, and yes, very relieved that we managed to get it installed last night on time.
It's a huge amount of work.
It was a huge amount of work. I hadn't completely understood, from having practiced the installs in the studio, setting up some of the pieces, just how different it would be when we got here. But the team I brought from London, combined with the team at the Nasher, have been just amazing and really on the case of it and completely understanding the physical demands. But it's been quite slow work with a lot of meticulous technical and physical issues to cope with that are partly to do with the elegance of the building and the maneuvering of the equipment around the building, and to do with technical issues arising that hadn't quite revealed themselves to the extent in the studio. You know, putting something up in the studio, you can maneuver things in all kinds of ways, but here it was much tighter, the space, in a way.
And how does it work preparing for a show like this? Do you do a site visit, or do you just get sent blueprints for the space?
No, we did quite an elaborate site visit and discussed all the physical entrances, the ways of getting into the space, because it's a bit like a ship in a bottle, you know. If I'm making work of this scale, there's got to be a very coherent plan of how the sections of the work can be brought into the building and what that entails from the Nasher's point of view and from my point of view in then reassembling the work.
So when you walk into the space, as you said, the ship in a bottle, the work is so large you don't know how it got in. How much do you consider the creative work to be actually on site as far as choreographing the relationships between the objects?
I would say 99.9%. However much I plan the configurations of the work, it's shocking about how that just collapses and I become the person who hasn't got a clue what they're doing, and I'm completely bewildered by what actions to take, and that very much happened here. I had a clarity of what to do in the first place, the first space, which is the entrance space. I was very clear that I would want the viewer, the public, to experience the work in a very physical way. So they were being invited to look up and into these crate-like blocks, which would take them in a way to the physical architectural qualities of the ceiling and the light in the space. So it's trying to collaborate between the features of the Nasher and also tease it or argue with it in some way, so that both experiences of the sheer beauty of the building was being acknowledged in relationship to something that was perhaps contrasting with that, and that gave a new view for the audience of how to walk through that first space, which is a bit of an obstacle course. So I hoped my ideal situation would be that they would be both looking through, across, down and up. And the encounter with the work would give them as much physical dynamic within the space as possible.
Do you see the viewers almost as a performer in the space?
Absolutely, it's a choreographic. It's something where I imagine a kind of choreography going on where the audience, in a way, is as much a material as the work. I don't mean that in a belittling way to the audience, but whilst I'm making the work, I don't think of the audience at all. It's impossible to bring that into the process of making. But once the work is in a space, it becomes a crucial part of how the work delivers itself to the space and to the viewer, you know. So the viewer becomes, in my mind, a performer within it, and that in a way transcends whether they hate the work or love the work. You know, both positions are equally valid, you know? But their way of encountering it becomes very much to do with movement through the space and how they themselves experience looking at the work through these actions of looking up, around, backwards and forwards and through.
And I think for some people that will be a surprise because they're not used to seeing work of this scale or being squeezed round in one corner to get another view, because there's so many different positions to each one of these sculptures that give you a whole new perspective on the piece. And then there's also the relationship that they have with each other, that depending on where you're standing as a viewer, you get a different horizon almost.
I mean, that I don't quite know what sculpture owns as its specific art discipline now. You know, everything, there's such a huge breadth of media that artists can use now, and where sculpture situates itself within that continues to fascinate me. I always have seen sculpture as the still and the moving coming together, the object is still and the movement belonging to the human encounter.
So we finish the work.
In a way, that movement around is the antithesis of the painterly experience, where in conventional, traditional terms, the painting is on the wall and you walk backwards and forwards to look at it along the length of the painting. So there's a limited physical encounter in that way, a very particular and special encounter. But with sculpture, the movement around the work or through the work has a very, very different significance, in the sense that you're constantly losing the image. As soon as you've caught the image, which of course the camera can do, but we in our encounter with sculpture are constantly losing that single shot of the sculpture as we walk around the 360 degrees. So the movement is an essential part, paradoxically, of what the stillness of the sculpture is in its character.
So we're constantly finishing the work, and I guess depending on the performer, the audience member, each one gets their own perspective depending on how they choose to interact with it.
Yes,
I'm thinking with the
yes.
painting that you were saying, you have a more limited perspective. Maybe a child has a different perspective. They look up at the painting than the adult. Or maybe your mood also affects how you read something. But with a sculpture, especially of this size, some people may interact with it from one angle only, whereas somebody else might keep going around it.
Yes, I mean, even the viewer who walks past it, and certainly at the Tate, I made the work to be walked past rather quickly. I imagined it as a thoroughfare space at the Tate. I wasn't expecting viewers to stand and contemplate. I saw it almost as
a corridor.
A journey through it, almost as though in the way you would be in a vehicle or a car and you just gaze rather dreamily out of the window and the landscape is passing you by. I saw the Tate as something that gets passed by.
Right.
But even for me, that is an exciting proposition. There isn't a specific time you have to spend with any one artwork.
Right.
You know, somebody might just walk through this and say, I haven't got the time of day for this kind of work. I still think that's quite a valid position to have, because I think the walking past quickly
is still an experience.
Yes, still an experience, exactly.
Right.
And the more contemplative figure of 8 kind of movement through the space is the ideal, but I can't possibly legislate that that's the way it should be experienced. So
I'm wondering what the difference is, and there is a definite difference. This isn't stage design, this isn't a set, and yet usually when someone talks about performers, then the idea is that they're in a set that we're viewing, and yet these aren't. They're sculptures, but they're the scale of sometimes sets. Do you think that the difference between a set and a sculpture of this size and installation is more about the fact that you're not pushing a narrative, or is it something else that distinguishes it?
that's fascinating, because I think again, the conventional, traditional theatrical experience is you sit. I know
passive.
not all theatre is like that. There's lots of challenges to theatre like that. But if I just take the traditional aspect where you're sitting and the stage is presented from that point of view of being the audience in a fixed position. But what I find absolutely compelling about theatre is that dual role of it having a dormant state when the lights are all off and it's asleep in a way, to the moment when the lights are all on and it's activated. I think that the whole process of sculpture is very my way of making is very in tune with that. I like the idea that the black box space as a whole experience, front and back, the waiting, the rehearsal, the
chapters, the process.
Yes, and then the front of house view with everything glowing and gleaming, and then the behind the scenes thing as a whole experience where one is dependent on the other, is very much what I love about that theatrical experience, that this question of the suspension of belief, or is it the suspension of disbelief? In the end, they both come round to meaning the same thing. You know, you have to, if you're at the opera, you have to, in a way, go with what the form of opera is, or else you'll just walk out of the theatre and say,
you embrace it.
That's the maddest thing I've ever been to. I don't understand.
People singing instead of
a
talking.
full-blown orchestra.
This isn't real. No.
Incredible costumes. You know, the whole thing is like the most extraordinary concoction of
madness and fun.
Yes. So in a way, the theatrical aspect of the work is something I'm unashamedly want to embrace, that the work has its vulnerability of showing how it's made, how it's put together, which is what I call the backstage idea of it. And then the front stage is, in a way, its aspiration to be finished, which may or may not be experienced. You know, the things may have such a rough and ready look that there's an uncertainty about whether they are finished.
And then what does that mean? And I mean, I know that you recycle. I don't mean what does it mean when you say it, but I mean what does it mean when somebody else looks at work and says, is it finished or not? Because things are perhaps always in a process of developing.
Well, I think that's true, but when I look at the wonderful Medado Rossos in this collection, you see the wax sitting in the plaster mould, And yet, for me, that's a moment caught in time that's complete. We're seeing both the mold and the objects that's in the process of being cast into something else, you know, but it hasn't been, it's been arrested at that moment. And it's like going around the British Museum or in Rome, you know, seeing the antiquities where there are fragments or parts of objects that we just accept as part of the huge lineage of Western culture. We don't have a problem with looking at a limbless torso. We accept it absolutely unquestioningly as great, you know. I'm in a way interested in that idea of the work arrested at the most least point of being finished, if that makes any sense, that it's allowed to be half finished, and that is a statement in its own right. Working on this scale and finding that point of something that could possibly go on is an act of artifice. It's an act of fakery in a way, you know, which I think again...
But you're wearing it. I mean,
yes.
You're being very clear about it, aren't you?
Yes,
you're not
I hope
faking
so,
it.
yes. But I suppose I love the provisional or the urgent, the half done, the abandoned, you know, all those qualities that are so prevalent in our world today, you know. Not everywhere is finished and ready to go, you know. Things are in all sorts of different stages of collapse and ruin and about to be restored, repaired, reclaimed. And, you know, we've just had these storms in Texas, you know, or
mass floods,
terrible earthquakes in Nepal. There's this constant relationship between nature's savagery, if one wants to call it that, and human brutality. And the two things often look, you know, appear very similar.
We want to thank Phyllida for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to NasherSculptureCenter.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.